My great delight to welcome all of you to this special lecture event featuring the Baylor University Press book, this one right here, Qohelet, Searching for a Life Worth Living. This book we'll hear about today contains beautiful illuminations of Qohelet by artist Debra Band, set alongside a philosophical commentary on the text by philosopher Menachem Fisch. And we are pleased that both Debra and Menachem can be with us here today. Baylor University Press is known for the stress we place on the tangible book, the object, the bound print text you hold in your hand while you're reading. And we consider Qohelet, Searching for a Life Worth Living, to be the paragon of that attentiveness to excellence in print publishing. It has been a joy for our team to work with Debra and Menachem to help them realize their vision for the print book. And we thank both of you for entrusting this wonderful project to the team at Baylor University Press. It has been a delight and a joy to work with you. Let me make two announcements related to the book before introducing our speakers. First, the Art Center of Waco downtown is hosting an exhibit featuring Debra's artistic illuminations from the book. Admission to the Art Center is always free, and the exhibit runs through March 16th. I hope you all attend. I'm also told that gilded prints of the illustrations will be available to visitors. Second, we did bring plenty of copies of the book for purchase. They're back in the back, and you can get yours from our table there after the presentations. And Debra and Menachem will be available to sign books following the event today. So let me introduce our two speakers. Menachem will go first today, and we will follow the lectures by Q&A. So Debra Band is an artist and researcher of Jewish texts and tradition. She holds a BA honors in history from Concordia University in Montreal and an MS in political science from MIT, but turned her full attention to Hebrew manuscript arts in 1987. She has published numerous illustrated books, including The Song of Songs, I Will Awake the Dawn, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah, and All the World Praises You. Menachem Fisch is an Israeli philosopher and professor emeritus of history and philosophy of science at Tel Aviv University. He is former president of the Israel Society for History and Philosophy of Science and former chair for the National Committee for History and Philosophy of Science at the Israel Academy of Science. And his many publications include Rational Rabbis, Covenant of Confrontation, and The Enemy Within. Menachem, we will hear you gladly.
Thank you. I'm... Thank you very much, David. Thank both Davids, David Nelson, David Aycock, for making this event happen, for getting us over here. It's a delight and joy to be in Waco. We're still taking it in. Great experience. So let me, before I hand this over to Debra to dazzle you with her fabulous artwork, let me quickly run through the main points of the reading of this book and start with what the book does not attempt to do, okay? And I apologize for those who will be disappointed by the fact that nothing in the book and nothing I'll have to say today will cast light on the mystery of Qohelet's composition. Okay, we do not know who wrote it, and even those who believe that Solomon did, we have no idea what Solomon's philosophical world was like, who he was arguing with, what kept him awake at night, and so on and so forth. And the book also doesn't bear on the historical question of who was in fact responsible for attributing to the book biblical status, okay, or who canonized it. what we try to do is to make religious sense of its inclusion in the Bible, not from a historical point of view, but by reading it in a way that that the text responds to a large degree at least, and which attributes to it a sufficiently religious content and project to justify its biblical status. And at the very end, I'll say something about the puzzling setting of Qohelet within the Jewish liturgical cycle, but only at the end. So, R.B. Weiss Scott's memorable Anchor Bible volume deems Qohelet to be the strangest book in the Bible, the book whose presence in Hebrew scripture is most inexplicable. Now, those of you familiar with the text, Qohelet firmly attests to there being one God in heaven, creator and judge of all. It's a monotheistic religious premise to the book. But on the other hand, the text makes absolutely no mention at all of divine covenant, of divine law, of divine revelation. And this omission has to be addressed by any viable reading of the text. Alan Mittelman, in a very fine recent book, concludes that if Qohelet knows of divine revelation, he brackets its importance or relevance. And I read Qohelet not as a religious thinker ignorant or indifferent to divine revelation, but as a religious thinker grappling with a religious problem that he believes must be addressed prior to attempting to heed to God's word, as offering a religious yet pre-revelatory, excuse the sort of technical phrase, pre-revelatory discourse, if you wish. Now, any serious reading of Qohelet must be clear about its overall premise, which is never taken back, and the question that follows from it, which are laid out in the second and third verses of the book. So the premise is that all but all is Hevel, and I'll leave that word untranslated for the moment. A word repeated 5 times in that one opening verse. And the question, what yitaron? Again, a key word which I'll leave uninterpreted for a second, whatever that means, has man of all his labor wherein he labors under the sun. If all is Hevel, whatever that means, what yitaron can any human endeavor boast, whatever that means, to have under the sun? Now, of the two terms, yitaron in Hebrew is the more straightforward, taken invariably as profit, advantage, or value, or as Alan Mittelman nicely suggests, echoing the Latin amplius, what remains, you know. But the question of yitaron changes dramatically according to how one understands the key term of Qohelet, which is Hevel. Now, following the Latin vanitas, most read Hevel as denoting meaninglessness, futility, even absurdity, which renders Qohelet's question, then, rhetorical. If all we can ever think or do amounts to nothingness, what value indeed can our undertakings ever boast? Qohelet is hence read by many as proving the worthlessness of all serious human effort and as advocating, say on the basis of chapter 9, or I'd say a misreading of chapter 9, taking pleasure in life while one can, while at the same time, on the basis of 12, fearing God and obeying his command. But even the best of such readings leave much of the text unattended. The curious change of tone, which I'll talk about at the beginning of chapter 3, the sober counsels of the end of chapter 6 and all of 7, the political musings of chapter 4, the wise farmer of chapter 11, beautifully depicted, as you will see by Debra, and much more. I read Qohelet's Hevel premise differently. The term Hevel is indeed employed in the Hebrew Bible to denote meaninglessness and futility. But only, read my lips, only with regard to idolatry and idolaters. When applied to human life, it is employed, as in the Psalms, to connote a mist-like temporality, which certainly need not be meaningless nor absurd. And because applied by Qohelet to both the human lifespan as well as to human understanding and undertaking, I take him as deeming them not only to be transient, but wholly temporal, not merely fleeting, but inherently time-bound. If all we can accomplish is forever contingently grounded in the ever-changing here and now, I take Qohelet as asking, if what we consider undeniably true or good today can be denied tomorrow, if we can never be sure of what we are sure, what could ever count as an undertaking of proven worth? How under conditions of perpetual doubt can we lead a life for whose value we can vouch? And the next 8 verses restate the question in terms of the despairing incongruity between what us philosophers dub ontology and epistemology, between nature's timeless law-governed cycles in gold and our time-bound and hence wholly inadequate attempts to comprehend them in white. Doomed to live in a world we can never assuredly understand, we perceive reality as unfolding in time, while in truth there is nothing new under the sun. And memory too is to no avail, because accruing more and more time-bound picturings can never yield a timeless portrayal. And at this point, specifically verse 12 of chapter 1, at this point Qohelet switches from the third person to the tortured first-personal testimony of a profoundly religious thinker who gave his heart to seek by wisdom concerning all things done under the heaven, only to find that what God has given man to be exercised by is a bad, even evil matter, inyan ra in Hebrew. Talking of what God has given, the Hebrew word is natan, has given humans to contend with, strongly implies, certainly to the Hebrew speaker, that the basic discrepancy between reality as it is and how we comprehend it is not only not diminished by divine revelation, but in fact applies to divine revelation. Both God's books, to take the old Christian metaphor, both God's book, the book of nature, and that of Scripture, are authored in timeless perfection that wholly transcends the ever-changing vagaries of human understanding, rendering them equally ungraspable as such by those he has made responsible for his world and the covenantal recipients of his word. Oblivious to God's standards, how can we prudently subject ourselves to God's will if we can never know it? This states an anxious and distraught Qohelet is the evil and crushing matter we are obliged by God to respond to, la'anot bo, in Hebrew, meaning to answer, to be tortured by a very loaded verb, in tortured realization of our total inadequacy to do so. But what causes Qohelet to realize the full horror of his predicament are his 2 dismally failed attempts to undermine it. Being of supreme wisdom, he states, speaking as King Solomon, I set upon a keen study of human wisdom itself, hoping to achieve certain understanding, only to find that even the wisest of humans is only humanly wise and therefore incapable of surpassing reason's inherent time-boundedness. Much wisdom is much anger, and he that increases knowledge increases pain. I urge you to compare my translations of the Hebrew to the standard translations, which are all muted in a rather suspicious way, I have to say. And what is unachievable by the wisest of words cannot be achieved by the best of works. Chapter 2 portrays Solomon's Jerusalem as a model of utilitarian morality, if I'm allowed the term, not the story of an immensely rich man's indulgences, but that of a king who achieved more for his people than any other. Yet even Solomon's unrivaled achievements prove no less transient than his wisdom. And Qohelet's despair knows no limit, causing him at the end of chapter 2 to abhor life and despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. And this is the darkest, despairing passage in the entire Old Testament. But this is not where Qohelet's argument terminates, as most readings have it. This is where it begins. The contrast between the dark loathing of life at the end of chapter 2 and the buoyant optimism of the Song of Seasons that opens chapter 3 is dramatic. In realizing that for everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under the heaven, and I've even changed my beat in reading that verse, Qohelet seems able to re-embrace life and to revisit almost verbatim the heart-gripping quandary from which he set forth, yet with no anger now and no bitterness. He now sees the task which God has given us to contend with, but no longer deems it to be a painful or an evil matter, no longer an inyan ra. Now, what I propose Qohelet realizes with a jolt at the opening of chapter 3 is that although God's timeless and perfect norms are indeed humanly unknowable, to hold us accountable to standards that we are incapable of knowing in principle would constitute a violation of God's perfect justice, because he cannot but be aware of our inherent time-boundedness. He created us. It is unthinkable that he, God, will hold us to his humanly unknowable, timeless standards. So I hence read chapter 3's opening verse like as follows: because God created us and our world in time, therefore there must also be a time for every divine desire and expectation, chefetz in Hebrew, under the heaven. God will judge us not by his timeless standards, but by the time-bound quality of our time-bound assessments. He will not expect us to arrive at absolute criteria good for all time about planting and building or waging war, but to do our time-bound best to determine if it is now the time to plant or to uproot the planting, to kill or to heal, to wage war or to make peace. And with a great sigh of relief, Qohelet realizes that the task we face is no longer devastating. God has set everything beautifully in time and has also given, the word given again, the world in our heart, knowing that we can never comprehend it from the beginning to the end. We are expected to do our context-dependent best to do good, not to somehow meet unknowable divine standards. And referring back to the world that we cannot fully grasp, we can never fully grasp, Qohelet enables today's reader, like yourself, to appreciate his change of heart. The very idea of proven scientific truth, and I'm doffing my philosopher of science cap for one moment, the very idea of proven scientific truth we now realize is a conceit. Scientific laws, general laws, can never be proved. Scientists form hypotheses, test them to their best ability, and replace them when they are found wanting. At its very, very best, science remains undetermined and fallible, yet none would consider science to be meaningless, futile, or vain. Qohelet will extend this insight to all serious human judgment and attempt to determine what amounts to doing one's humanly best in this regard, but some preliminaries need to be dealt with first. Two positions Qohelet dismisses. I mean, if this wasn't a formal lecture, I'd say poo-poos as foolish. The over-pious who rely passively on divine providence and retribution rather than risk erring by taking responsibility for their world, and at the other extreme, the uber-wise who poo-poo the Hevel premise by haughtily confusing their feeling of certainty with certainty itself. Qohelet has no patience with either categories of fools. He dismisses them. He doesn't argue with them. Chapter 4 combats the political problem raised by the Hevel premise. How to prevent society from being torn apart by its members' inevitably diverse culture-specific ideas of the good. This isn't Hobbes's problem about, how to live in a society despite our animal nature. No, it's about people determined to do what's right, and yet because they have different conceptions of right, they're at each other's throats all the time. Okay? His ingenious answer is that social cooperation does not require normative consensus. Social stability can be achieved by agreeing to stand together in the face of natural hazard and human menace. It is always preferable to standing alone, despite our normative differences. Chapters 5 and 6 warn first against identifying a worthy life with ardent vertical ritual observance. We know people like that. And second, against gauging the worth, its worth in terms of material gain, and we know people like that. Qohelet understands the temptation of reducing the worthy to material worth and argues firmly against it. And reducing rectitude to utility, as in game-theoretic models of rationality, is highly problematic, but that would be a topic for a very different talk. Qohelet embarks on his own positive account of wise human conduct with a powerful, if largely misread image, and I urge you, compare this to the English translations. What advantage, he asks, has the wise man more than the fool? And his answer is, if you want to understand the mindset of the wise man, think of a poor man. Think of a poor man who knows how to go against life. Critical of what life has dealt them and determined to improve it, such poor people assume responsibility by imagining ways to improve their world, scrutinizing them critically before settling on a way forward, keenly combining a value judgment and informed speculation. They apply their standards of propriety to expose what they deem to be wrong with their world and imagine putting right. And knowing humbly that they are liable to err, and even when right, they are liable to be unsuccessful. But Qohelet also knows that even the wisest are poor self-critics. Because we use our norms to criticize, we are incapable of holding them, our norms, in critical check, which is where normative diversity emerges for Qohelet as an asset. Chapter 7 is about enhancing self-critical reflection by exposing oneself to similarly trying situations to those one faces and to the normative critique of others. That's the most important. Better to seek a good name than precious ointment, to go to houses of mourning rather than to those of mirth, to seek the rebuke of the wise rather than the praise of the fools, and so forth. And that chapter ends, and we could have spent a whole seminar about just those verses. And that chapter ends with a sobering realization that even maxims that are considered by everyone as undeniably valid Okay, such principles that you'll never get a critical challenge because everybody agrees to. And his example is to always avoid the company of reckless, illicit women. That's his example. But those two remain uncertain, even though the principle strikes us as undeniable, because they can never be applied with certainty. Who knows if the specific woman we're talking about falls under that category or not? Chapter 8 explores the limits of accountability. The limits of accountability is when weighing personal risk against standing up to a monarch one considers wrong, beautifully depicted, as you will see, by Debra. Qohelet is adamant that God does not hold us responsible for wrongs that we cannot prevent, although one can never be sure where to draw that line. He then dismisses two familiar reactions to seemingly unpunished evil for vainly purporting or presuming to know God's final judgment. Those who see in it proof of divine injustice, and those who see it as proof that such evil is really good. Chapter 9 combats the only rival position that Qohelet takes seriously, benign hedonism, who fully accept his analysis, yet see no sense in adopting the anxious, perpetually self-doubting life Qohelet prescribes, and they opt rationally to best enjoy their brief respite on earth instead. And he argues that case so effectively that everyone I know actually, reads that verse as Qohelet presenting his own position, but he doesn't. Indeed, counters Qohelet, we never know when disaster might strike, but predicting and preparing for calamity are two very different things. Those Qohelet considers wise will have studied such calamities and planned for them as best they can, and will be in a position to save, or at least in the best position, to save the city when disaster strikes. Pleasure-bound societies will not only be unprepared, they will have no room for such permanently misanthropic party poopers, and wretched and rejected they will go unheeded. And chapter 10 and 11 set two powerful portrayals side by side, an Aristophanic dystopia of a city run by fools set against a powerful example of human wisdom at its best in the form of a Qohelet-wise farmer hedging his bets in the face of certainty. And therefore by mid-chapter 11, having solved his problem, Qohelet can declare in deliberate contrast, in stark contrast, to chapter 2's dark despair, that raising our eyes from the human vantage point under the sun, truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. No longer crushed by the unbreachable chasm between God in heaven and we upon the earth, he has come to understand that despite our heavenly existence, it is possible to lead a divinely approved life, wisely led and worth living. And Qohelet can finally, calmly face death, not as a denial of life's worth, but as a natural development, tenderly describing us departing this world, accompanied by the equally transient, soon to be outmoded fruits of our accomplishments. And as my late father, in a wonderful essay on Qohelet, writes, never has there a gentler poem on the approach of death. And death becomes, and I quote, the beauty of a golden sunset as the dust returns to the earth and the spirit to meet its maker. Now, in light of this reading, the book's last 4 verses need not be read as a later apologetic appendage. If you're interested, we can talk about that in the Q&A. And when, at the end of our book, Debra and mine, when all is said and done, as I said at the beginning, I briefly address Qohelet's liturgical placement As some of you may know, it is ritually read during the Festival of Tabernacles, the Festival of Sukkot, deemed by the rabbis to be the most joyous of Jewish festivals. Well, Sukkot, and this picture was taken in the ultra-Orthodox quarter of Mea Shearim of Jerusalem a couple of years ago. Sukkot is, of course, dedicated first and foremost to leaving our permanent dwellings and taking up residence in temporary unstable booths, a celebration of our essential temporality and transience, if you wish, an expression of our joyful satisfaction, my rendering of Qohelet's word, simcha, in knowing that we can pursue divinely sanctioned lives of real value despite the thoroughgoing impermanence of our very existence. Thank you so very much. Debra, how do I turn this to you? I know, you do it.
Let's see. Why is this not going away? There we go. Eureka. Menachem has heard me say way too often that this is one of my favorite ontological proofs when these things come together. So it is a pleasure to be with you at Baylor to share this project, which is the realization of a 30-year plus obsession. I'm so grateful to everyone we've worked with at Baylor University Press, to Dave Nelson and Kay Jarrell and David and Jenny and the whole team who have worked with us so closely to bring this deeply meaningful book that's stirring people all over the world to a new reading of Qohelet or Ecclesiastes to life. Is that better? Lovely. Okay, sorry about that. I am not good with mics. My first conversation with Qohelet was triggered by a family tragedy on the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when I was 31. The sudden death by traffic accident of a much beloved stepbrother, only a few months older than me. I managed to arrive home in Montreal in time for the funeral and entered a maelstrom of shock and grief that I had never yet experienced, although the near death of my second child, soon after birth the previous year, had been, thank God, only a near miss. One evening, I returned to my parents' home from the Shiva house before others and picked Qohelet off their library bookshelf. I cannot at all remember what drew me to it. Maybe this was the Saturday evening after its annual ritual chanting in synagogue, but I spent the rest of the evening circling their foyer, gripping this book, my eyes glued to Qohelet's words. Now, I want you to know that before that night, I had dutifully followed the annual synagogue chanting of Qohelet on Sukkot, on Tabernacles, but never paid much attention to it. It just seemed very remote. But now the phrase, oh, he understands how random, how arbitrary death can be, reverberated in my head and has never faded. Many years have passed since that night, crowded, as for many of us, with both intense joy and terrible grief, and throughout, Qohelet has stayed with me. That first evening, I absorbed some sense of his understanding that we all live subject to an inscrutable divine will, and the best we can do is to live every moment as well, as deeply, and intentionally as we can, while we can, for life can vanish. I'd only just begun my work in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts at that point, but my itch to explore Qohelet took hold that evening. I made a couple of false starts at it over the years, but knew that Qohelet was saying something more than I was understanding. was about 25 years until a Sabbath dinner at Menachem's and his wife's Chana's home during a Meet the Family trip to Israel shortly after my second husband's and my wedding. When Menachem casually, innocently, asked me about my plans for my next project, I shook my head and replied that I really, really wanted to work on Qohelet, but had wandered into a fog bank every time I tried. Oh, I've written on Qohelet. He says, let me send you the article. The following week, I downloaded and devoured it, and lo, light suddenly began to pierce the mists. Menachem adventurously agreed to discuss a joint project a week or two later when I had the chutzpah to inform him that we were going to be doing this, although he was somewhat puzzled about how one could possibly visualize this abstract text. But that is my job. Now, you might well ask, well, very nice, but what is the point of this completely archaic medium altogether now in the era of never mind printing, but the internet and AI? Let me answer this today by sharing with you the ways that I approach the creation of modern Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, and then showing you some of the 60 illuminations themselves. And you can see them all at Art Center Waco. The exhibit looks gorgeous. You'll see how an illuminated manuscript can do far more than enhance the aesthetics and emotions of a reader's experience, but actually interpret and amplify the subtleties of the text, its relationship to our greater world, in a coherent visual midrash. Here, a leisurely contemplative gaze at its imagery brings to human level complex ideas about Qohelet's intent, as Menachem has revealed it, and detects the reverberations of this odd but vital text across not only the Jewish culture that produced, protected, and cherished it, but also across surrounding Western civilization. A painting, or a sculpture for that matter, can communicate dozens of ideas instantly. And an illumination also ties us to 2 millennia of our history beautifully. This 1434 painting, which I'm sure some of you know, is from the hand of an artist who came out of the tradition of illuminated manuscripts. And this painting has taught me almost everything I know about building the meaning of a painting. I work daily under a reproduction, and to visit with it in the National Gallery is just about my first stop on even the briefest trip to London. And I have a date planned next Monday afternoon. The religious and ethical value of every single item you see here adds up to a detailed moral and ethical marriage contract between 2 15th century young people, not simply a fusion of 2 Florentine banking families. Just a few examples here. The dog represents fidelity. The sabots, the clogs, protection from the elements. The single candle glowing in the chandelier, the light of Jesus. And under that mirror in the center, the artist actually witnessed, in Latin, Jan van Eyck was here. Now, obviously, since I work within Jewish tradition, my imagery is entirely different from that of 15th century Christianity. Mine is based in other related biblical texts, colorful exegesis from many rabbinic sources, and many avenues of Western thought and science. One of my challenges over 3 decades has been to develop a modern Jewish iconographic vocabulary capable of teasing out abstract concepts in visual form. Following the lead of Van Eyck, as analyzed by the great art historian Erwin Panofsky, I create disguised symbolism in a scene that usually makes some kind of logical sense, and everything is explained in commentaries in each book. So, how do I construct my visual midrash? Moshe Halbertal has described Jewish culture as a text-centered community, and my own interpretive work is nothing if not text-centered. Each project begins with some years studying the chosen text, in this case Qohelet, along with its rabbinic commentaries and modern academic Bible studies. There are also regular discussions with my collaborators. Menachem and I work together by Zoom right through the lockdown. I begin each painting by writing, and as I consider each passage, many more associations come to mind, and I develop a mental picture of where I want to go. I rarely sketch these anymore. The layout happens in my mind, and then I set to work, laying out text and micrography, and I'll get to micrography in a moment, doing that first, then proofing carefully, and then painting in gouache, and finally gilding. Since one always sees a two-page spread in a book, I paint both facing illuminations simultaneously. Here, I base my visual midrash of Qohelet that runs through 60 paintings on Menachem's Hevel premise that the human lifespan is short, and not only we, but all our discrete deeds are transient. Nothing lasts forever. And separated as we are from the divine, we cannot possibly fathom God's expectations of us, just though we know they are. Although we know we ultimately face divine judgment. Let me show you how this visual midrash of Qohelet works. So you see here a painting of the Alhambra on its ridge in Granada. The micrographic border surrounding the painting presents roughly the first third of Qohelet. You'll see the rest in the next slide. So now, what's micrography? This is the art, if you look at the close-up there, this is the art of making patterns, sometimes whole pictures, of lines of teeny tiny text, sort of something like 1 or 2 point. And it's a medium specific to the Jewish scribal tradition, and I've seen it in codexes of the Bible going back to about the 9th century. It's a little psychotic, but it's wonderful fun. And I do no glasses and about 3 inches from my parchment. But the bigger question here is why the Alhambra? This corresponds directly to Menachem's Hevel premise. Our grandest, most exquisite monuments are ephemeral, just as are our lives and endeavors. And of course, Qohelet dons the cloak of the great King Solomon, kind of an avatar, as he analyzes the human condition. In the paintings ahead, I compare human life and deeds, labors, as Qohelet would say, to a grand and gorgeous palace full of lives bursting with action and conversation, beauty and tragedy. Yet even this grandeur will crumble in time. This palace metaphor now draws upon a tradition very common in Midrash, comparing the heavens to a palace and the human world to its orchards and garden. I extend this metaphor to human life and deeds. And what grander palace than the Alhambra, the wondrously beautiful medieval palace and gardens of the Muslim Nazrid rulers of Granada. The Alhambra also hosted much of the vibrant, poetry-filled court life of the medieval Spanish or Sephardic community. And yet, for all its glory, all the almost audible ghosts of the glittering and powerful people who strode its expanses, if you look into the corners of its mosaic-encrusted walls, if you look at the stonework lining its garden paths, you see that even this massive glory slowly crumbles into the red dust from which it arose. The golden rim of this painting alludes to the golden bowl raised in the 12th chapter. It's not yet cracked here, and haunts the entire manuscript. So, while the Alhambra provides the setting and the central metaphor, I flesh out the sense of the fragile and fugitive beauty of human experience with iconography, with symbolism drawn from related biblical and other Jewish texts, from archaeology, the natural world, science, and far more modern icons relating to issues Qohelet explores. And I promise you're going to be surprised in a moment. I include poetry and prose not only from the Hebrew Bible, but from across Western civilization to help reveal the enduring reality of Qohelet's thought across millennia and landscapes far from his own. An area of mist penetrates every painting, always reminding us of the ephemerality of all human deeds. I introduce all of these to conjure up a visual midrash probing Qohelet's struggle to understand the workings of the universe, to find wisdom, that is what God demands of us, despite our transience and vantage point under the sun. On the Hebrew page here, the philosopher's eye, Menachem's of course, peers through the initial letter. The plain clay jar spilling the jewels that tumble down around the words describes, in a midrash quoted for each of the books attributed to Solomon, that wise king's unsealing of the wisdom of Torah. This is a traditional image associated with the pre-revelatory notion that Menachem mentioned a little while ago. The rabbis compare the Torah to a sealed jar full of jewels, but only when opened and spilled could the riches be found. And this was Solomon when he composed Qohelet, taking that clay jar, that plain clay jar, and turning it upside down. Now, I will leave you to explore the meaning of the English painting in the book. The philosopher compares the immutable cycle of life to the daily journey of the sun and to the water cycle. All three beyond the reach, at least until recently, of human will and action. The mosaic repeats its own complex man-made pattern endlessly in colors that echo the sea, sky, sunlight, and forests. Outside, ephemeral mist, Hevel, rises from the gardens below into the clouds, only to fall to land and sea as rain. The cloud of micrographic text in the Hebrew illumination includes passages of the 11th century Spanish Jewish philosopher and poet Solomon ibn Gabirol's Neoplatonic philosophical tract in verse, The Royal Crown. This is a gorgeous work. He incidentally lived and worked in the Alhambra for some time, albeit granted in an earlier, far less grand incarnation. The first passage included here ponders our inability to comprehend God's eternity. The second laments the clouds of human imperfection that obscure humanity's view of divine wisdom, which is likened here to light. Gazing from his high tower, the omnipotent ruler struggles to accept that he cannot rise from under the sun to perceive divine wisdom. He despairs of the ephemerality of even his rich and powerful life. The Hebrew word ani, I, rests upon a regal carpet, while the glittering gold between the lines fit for a royal manuscript seemed to ridicule the earthbound philosopher's inability to find heavenly wisdom. The English pronoun I rests upon a clay bulla of the Judean royal seal. And the balustrade upon which he rests is from the ruins of the Judean palace at Ramat Rachel, hinting at the monumental palace that Qohelet's Solomon avatar inhabits. Now, in the background, the starry sky is based on a Hubble Space Telescope image of the ultra-deep field of space, which I have long used to symbolize God's invisible but all-suffusing presence, and in this book in particular, to allude to how every particle of our world cycles endlessly through the stars. He asks, can one find wisdom by indulging in luxury? Qohelet's sensual pleasure and pride in his material achievements are clouded by his realization that all his luxuries evaporate. In the Hebrew illumination, Qohelet gazes upon his irrigated orchards and vineyards. This Persian period philosopher would already associate water flowing in this arid land with the wisdom of Torah, a ubiquitous metaphor found throughout the prophets and the writings. The cherry branches in the border, emblematic of the seat of American power in Washington, D.C., where these illuminations were painted, progress through their annual cycle, reminding him of the passing of generations. Despite Qohelet's pride in all the beauty that he's amassed, the drifting fog reminds him of the ephemerality of all of his wealth here under the sun. By the latter part of the second chapter, as Menachem so eloquently described, The philosopher king has plunged into abject despair as he realizes that there is no way for even the wisest, most powerful of humans to be able to reach up to grasp divine wisdom, that all his riches and accomplishments will evaporate. Vanished are the luxuriant views of vineyards and orchards. Instead, angrily broken jewelry, a golden chain, and precious antique in his day, carnelian beads that he might have given his wife or lover lie broken amidst his words, and the very words pale and twist and burn with his misery. Okay, just a few words about these paintings of perhaps the most beloved part of Qohelet. At right, with the first verse of the chapter, the philosopher king gazes into a garden pond, again alluding to the golden bowl of chapter 12, and it's still not cracked here. Qohelet begins to find comfort in human limitations on wisdom as he meditates further on how every situation in life has its moment, even if that moment is unknowable to any but God. Here he perceives life as a stream, its beginning and end obscure, always subject to sudden turbulence. Now, if you look up at the top of the stream, the little mosaic bears a fragment of the musical notation of what else but Pete Seeger's famous 1965 setting of the song, Turn, Turn, Turn. And now for something completely different. Qohelet turns to consider the foolishness of oppressors and plutocrats in the face of both human and divine authority. The Hebrew illumination presents the ancient flail and sword used for punishment, used for oppression, while the English illumination begins with more modern tools of oppression. That's a taser up there. Coins spill everywhere. I said you might be surprised. Again, the starlit heavens of the Hubble image. Again, divine intent obscured from human view by clouds of mist. Qohelet ends his warnings about irresponsible actions with this assurance that God wants humankind to live happily, taking pleasure in our work, fully enjoying its fruits throughout our days. This, he asserts, is the wisdom vouchsafed to humankind under the heavens. And the illuminations offer each text within a golden triangle, the Greek letter delta that signifies mathematical concepts of change. The animals surrounding the texts allude to this exhortation in the Talmudic ethical tract, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, which echoes Qohelet's ideas of the importance of living wisely, that is, according to our best guess of what God expects of us down here under the sun. Be bold as a leopard, as light as an eagle, as swift as a gazelle, and as brave as a lion, to do the will of your Father in heaven. Okay, Qohelet here warns his students to avoid hazardous behavior and instead pursue wise, careful self-conduct. He contrasts two metaphorical images of women current in his day to sketch the tug of war between wisdom and foolishness. Now, this passage is often assumed to be a bit of misogyny, and I can't completely deny that. But I would suggest that the gendered language itself, Hebrew is a strongly gendered language, and that this argues against so literal a reading. Chokhmah, wisdom, the object of Qohelet's search, after all, is a feminine word. There's no getting around that. Throughout the book of Proverbs, which is roughly contemporary with Qohelet, wisdom is characterized as a woman, a teacher and a model for all humankind. Indeed, Proverbs ends with the famous Eshet Chayil, a powerful woman, as Ray Shendlin translated it for our Kabbalat Shabbat book, a paean to the wise and capable mother, homemaker, and businesswoman, all faces of lady wisdom. Conversely, Qohelet warns of the dangers of temptation by reckless, illicit women, if, of course, you can pin down exactly which woman is forbidden, characterized in Proverbs 9:13 by the feminine gender, ksilut, of the same word ksil, fool, that Qohelet continually applies to his negative role model. And the painting at the left, two micrographic texts contrast the two symbolic women. The wise woman at far right in the blue gathers her fruit, household keys, dangling from her waist, and she is composed of Esha Chayil, a powerful woman, and verses from Proverbs 9, all praising Lady Wisdom. At the left of that painting, in the red, a dancing woman, such as one might have seen at evening entertainments in the Alhambra, rattles a tambourine. She is composed of the aria Libiamo in the first act of Verdi's La Traviata, the interchange between the courtesan Violetta and the young Alfredo Germond. In contrast to the wise and prudent woman across the page, these soon-to-be lovers sing to each other about how life is all about embracing the pleasures of the moment. Now, this is a good place to show you another image that appears here and, in fact, on every painting. You can see a small honeybee on each. My name, Debra, is the Hebrew word for honeybee, and although I do indeed keep bees nowadays, since long before that, placing a bee in each painting has been my play on the medieval custom of the colophon, identifying a scribe. Here, Qohelet has moved on to consider the difficulties of a person of integrity serving a corrupt ruler. The illuminations offer cautionary images for both the arrogant ruler and the honest courtier. We see a painting of a marble statue of Justice, but pulling down her blindfold and winking. In contrast, the bordering calligraphy offers the very passage, "Justice, justice you shall pursue," from Deuteronomy 16, that famously requires the ruler to pursue honest and even-handed justice for all people. The English text begins with a painting that shows a crown lying in the gutter, a cautionary tale inspired by both Napoleon's remark about the crown of France lying in a gutter just waiting to be picked up by the tip of his sword, and General George Patton's observation that at Roman generals' triumph parades, a slave stood behind the conqueror, holding a golden crown and whispering in his ear a warning that all glory is fleeting. The decorative text bordering the English page illustrates the dangers attendant upon the honest courtier with Cordelia's speech from the beginning of King Lear. And finally, Qohelet arrives at the answer to his search for wisdom. His royal avatar gazes out at his orderly farmland and catches sight of a small but wise farmer working the land, dividing it into areas for different treatment. Some wither and some flourish. "Cast thy bread upon the waters," he says, "for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and even to 8, for thou knowest not what evils will be upon the earth. So take your chances, make contingency plans. Some plans will go awry, but some will flourish. This is the key to survival, to fulfillment in all your labors, and to wisdom." As he muses, his hand rests beside his beloved's, while the olives symbolize both his nobility and his growing family. The pomegranate branch, their fruitfulness, and the bottle of wine, his sanctification of God and his joy. Qohelet has found the elusive secret to a meaningful life beneath the unknowable heaven. We are nearing the end of Qohelet's reflections, the gentle and poetic ode to death that Menachem's father described so gracefully. You may recognize the Talmudic motto, "Know before whom you stand," that crowns the grand portal to this palace, just as it's crowned the Holy Ark in synagogues across the centuries. All of the diverse and busy lives lived in this palace, whether child or adult, laborer or scholar or aristocrat, all paths lead away from the sunlit courtyard toward shadow, oblivion, and certain divine judgment. So we see a fragile elderly laborer lugging a basket of grapes destined for a rich table, pregnant women celebrating each other's joy, children and aristocrats, and then in the distance, an old man hobbles into the inescapable, misty darkness at the end of the grand halls. Even the solid stone palace itself is ephemeral. The golden bowl of the courtyard fountain not only sprays, but also leaks the water that's essential to human life. Weeds have invaded the meticulously laid courtyard tiles, and the intricate mosaics have just begun to crumble. The almond tree is heavy with beautiful, fragrant white blossoms, but that's likely contemporary idiom for the white hair of old age. Nothing in this palace of human existence, even in this grandest of palaces, lasts forever. So then what does last forever if not human accomplishment? Only God. And Qohelet begins his paean to the end of human life under the sun by warning us to live constantly aware of the inevitability of divine judgment of our personal actions. The courtyard of his palace is filled with exhortations to live mindful of divine law. The pomegranate tree reminds the courtiers of fertility. We see pregnant women and the fruits of all of humankind's labors, but its many seeds also in Jewish tradition symbolize the 613 commandments. Midrashic associations with the pink lily at its root reminds them of the value of the Ten Commandments in the corrupt human world, and that thorny rose climbing its trunk recalls the humility of the burning bush. The grass that springs up between the courtyard tiles suggests the warning that occurs throughout biblical texts that sinners will vanish like dry grass. Think of Psalm 90. As throughout Jewish lore, the water that sprays from the fountain also symbolized the necessity of Torah to humankind throughout our lives under the sun. Far beneath the heavens, night falls over the palace of the philosopher king. That golden bowl framing the scene has finally cracked. Now, shortly before painting these, I happened upon a book of poetry reflecting on Qohelet, composed by the first of the two 11th century Jewish grand viziers who ruled in Granada. This was Samuel the Nagid. And you'll see about 44, if I remember, of the overall 120 some of these poems worked into the micrography on that page. One of these beautiful poems surrounds the text page, expressing the poet's determination to pursue life despite its transience. Soul opens inside you on beauty, and then tells you to seek in the world and ignore its flaws. Heart says, you'll live forever. And death, as it speaks, grasps you in it with claws. Qohelet's last words rest within fig branches cycling through the seasons. Throughout Jewish lore, figs embody many qualities of Israel, humankind, and the world. Here, they hint at the birth and passing of generations and the goodness of divine law. The oak branch bears the acorns that are the oak's future. The image alludes to Israel's strength to endure despite the passing of every individual, of even the Davidic kingdom itself. Isaiah prophesied that Israel would be reborn after conquest like the terebinth and the oak, of which stumps are left even when they are felled. Its stump shall be a holy seed. Like the oak seed and regenerating stump, long after his own death, Qohelet's words continue to offer humankind guidance toward a realistic yet meaningful life. So, thank you very much. Thank you. And shall I shut this?
Here we go. So for the room, we've actually got this fun little soft cube that is meant for Q&A times. And if you would like to ask the author and illustrator any questions about the work or about the presentation today, the lectures, I'll just toss you the ball of the square cube, and you can speak into it. I'll get the ball rolling, and that is
The cube
with a-
rolling.
What's that?
The cube
I'll
rolling.
get the cube tossing.
Yeah.
With a question about Menachem. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that many current, or I should say present-day translations of the book of Qohelet really obscure, soften, fail to meet the standard of meaning that is present within the Hebrew itself. You said that you were even a little suspicious of some translations. I'm curious if you could speak to the suspicion and what you feel like might be going on there.
Well, by the time that I can't say anything about the Greek rendition or the Latin rendition of the text, but by the time the Reformation came around, and Qohelet was translated into vernaculars like English, Qohelet was part of the Bible, and the minute you read his premise, as all human endeavor is meaningless and empty and absurd, and therefore, rhetorical question, what could count as a worthy life? Nothing, right? It's a kind of embarrassment for a text like that to be in the Bible, okay? So the harsh language of Qohelet, especially in the first 2 chapters, is toned down. It's toned down. The word simcha, which I translate as satisfaction in a serious sense, and it comes coupled, those of you who know biblical Hebrew, it comes coupled with lirot tov, to see good, the satisfaction in seeing good, of doing something. It is translated across the board in English as mirth and pleasure, as though this is a hedonistic text, which again is a kind of biblical embarrassment. I mean, there's no, and none of these readings, except one, makes any sense of the omission within Qohelet of, as I said, divine revelation and divine covenant and divine law, despite being seemingly a monotheistic treatise. So what's going on here? So it's kind of softened. I can walk you through philologically certain key terms, but so the suspicion is, because those responsible for the King James and for later translations knew their biblical Hebrew pretty well. And therefore I'm suspicious that the muting is not merely a misunderstanding of the text or a rather muting, taming of its radicality. But I'm not arguing against other readings. I mean, the book sort of allows our reading to speak for itself, and I deliberately made a decision not to run a verse-by-verse commentary, but rather to have a little introduction ahead of every chapter explaining the way I read the flow of the argument, and then for people to read the chapter and see for themselves if it gives to that kind of reading.
Thank you. Ready? Coming to you.
There you go.
Thanks so much for your works on Ecclesiastes. So I've been working on Ecclesiastes.
Can you speak to the box?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Speak into the box.
Yeah, I've been actually working on Ecclesiastes for my dissertation. So it was delightful to see you guys working on those, and yeah, I was delighted to see you guys coming to Waco. Yeah. So my topic is especially on the joy theme on Ecclesiastes, on the joy, the eating, drinking, and enjoyment. And I wonder what your take on the relationship between simha or ra'atov with the work. So a lot of people think it's like enjoying the work per se, or like find I don't know, you gotta like enjoy what you do, or is it enjoying the product of your work? So that's one of the things that I'm working on. Well, I have my opinion, but I just want to hear what your take on those, the relationship between work and enjoyment.
Well, let me put it this way. Qohelet is talking about serious work, of doing good, of the Hebrew term would be tikkun olam, mending the world, taking critical gaze around you, finding things wrong, finding things that you are trained and have the knowledge to improve, and to take responsibility for the world. I mean, all three monotheistic faith traditions have these myths of God making humankind responsible for the world under the sun. So the notion of toil under the sun is a loaded religious term for Qohelet, the way I read it. Okay? And of course, if you add to that, which is only hinted in the book, but not made quite explicit, is that understanding God's revelation is the very same kind of toil. We're supposed to, take make the effort to make sense of what God's saying to us. And of course, the $65,000 question, so to speak, is that if our standards of reading, if our vocabularies, normative vocabularies of what it means to do good, of what a problem consists in, of what viable solutions consist in, are all time-bound and contingent and a function of our upbringing, and had we been born elsewhere and in a different time, we'd be taking very different stock of our world and, I'll add quietly, of divine revelation, because different periods and different people will read it differently. Then how can we ever boast a worthy life? That's the big, big question. And he makes his peace with it by realizing that God doesn't expect from us more than we can do. And that is do our best according to our time-bound, contextual understanding, okay? And so on and so forth. But this, I mean, it all sounds very nice, and you're all nodding, but it's a radical theology. Because what this theology presupposes is that God, I say this quietly, cannot control his message. He can reveal his will, and then every single human reader of it will read it slightly differently, and some very differently. Okay? And there's no way for divine revelation to sort of crash through the glass ceiling of our time-boundedness. So when Qohelet makes his peace with the fact that God doesn't expect us to do more than our time-bound best, he's accepting the fact that his word will be, and his world will be refracted through the diversity of human normativity and human understanding. That's a radical theology. And once he's made his peace with that, we can open the rest of the Bible. In this sense, it's pre-revelatory. That's a reading. And open the rest of the Bible, not listening to an authoritative voice that tells you what it means, but doing your very, very best to find it out for yourself without the delusional expectation that we'll all read the same thing. We won't. But that's God's will. Okay, that's the religious message. And the only, that this is again for a very different lecture, the only large-scale human undertaking I know that is governed by that very norm is the Talmudic literature itself. But that's, again, a topic for a different talk.
Coming to you.
Go!
On a very different note, I'm fascinated by the micrography. Do you sketch that pattern out?
Yeah, there are very faint, either it's sketched out there or I work on over a light table.
Okay,
So I may have it drawn out on a piece of paper.
Okay.
And how precise I need to
Right.
be, and how much pencil I want to have to erase.
And a microscope.
yeah.
And a
right.
microscope.
No,
And I haven't,
no glass.
I have it on my list to go see your exhibit,
Lovely.
but how large are your
The
pieces?
pages are about 12 by 15, thereabouts.
Okay,
Yeah, 12 by 15, 12 by 16.
wonderful. They're beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I guess I had like a practical question about this time-boundness and in relation to prudence. So I was wondering if you had like practical, not, let's say sort of like an advice for cultivating this prudence in relation to our time-boundedness. The theological reflection of how does somebody willingly, prudentially subject ourselves to God's will if we cannot know it? It seems like that sort of question is still at the lower, like day to day also is a question that I find it's hard to see how that works out in the day to day.
So this is a let's say a two-tier picture. And the first tier is, you, like everybody else, are committed to a normative framework by which you judge yourself, by which you judge others, by which you judge your world. Standards of propriety, right and wrong, not only ethical, okay, scientific norms, aesthetical norms, and so on and so forth. And you make your decision, okay, about what's wrong and what deserves mending and how should I go about it. But at the same time, we have to realize that we're very poor critics of ourselves. In other words, it's very, very difficult to create critical distance from your own norms. Okay, if you're committed to liberalism, it's very difficult, impossible to find liberalism wrong by liberal norms. Okay, and so self-criticism of our very normative commitments is impossible if you only talk to yourself. I think what Qohelet has hit on is that there's something in exposing yourself to the critique of others whom you trust and whom you respect, but who think very, very differently from you. And we've all experienced it. When we're talking to people who we admire but who think differently, suddenly it's like watching yourself in a recording. You can suddenly see how others see you by their criticism in a way that you can never see yourself. And it's that exposure, that echo chamber, that's the wrong metaphor, right? Echo chamber of normative critique, which allows you to create distance from yourself. So what Qohelet is saying, to do your absolutely prudently best, is to make up your mind, but then try it out not against people who think like you. That will be a backslapping, that's like talking to yourself, but to people who are committed differently. And take their critique seriously. If you remain firm, you remain firm. That's fine. If you're destabilized, try and think again. But that's the best you can do. Okay? There's no voice from heaven which will tell you whether you're right or wrong. It's a kind of, I mean, the philosophical picture would be a kind of neo-Hegelian twist on the neo-Kantian argument, but don't take me there.
I guess the word is it gives a slight sort of a pragmatic sort of interpretation.
Modern
so,
American
yes,
pragmatism. Are you a philosopher?
I try to be.
You try to be. So the Pittsburgh Hegelians are the kind of school I belong to, Brandon, McDowell, that sort of, I'd say, third generation of American pragmatism.
All right. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the press and the libraries, thank you for being here. And we will have the books on sale if anybody wants to grab one. And then the authors, I'm sure, will be happy to sign it. Thank you again.
Thank you.